If you went through school in the United States, you probably learned the same story everyone else did. Rome fell because barbarians overran it. Or because Romans got soft, decadent, morally weak, too busy at the games, too comfortable, too far from the discipline that built the empire in the first place. Maybe you even heard the one about lead pipes slowly poisoning the entire population into madness. Here's the problem. Professional historians who've spent entire careers studying this collapse will tell you, almost unanimously, that none of those explanations, not on their own, actually holds up against the evidence. The real story is more complicated, more slow-moving, and in some ways more unsettling, because it wasn't a single dramatic cause. It was a set of interlocking failures, compounding over roughly 200 years, any one of which Rome might have survived, but not all of them, hitting at once. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why the fall of Rome has become one of the most argued over questions in all of history, with one 18th century writer's theory still shaping what most people believe today, even though most historians now think he only had part of the picture. This is the real story. Let's get into it. If deep historical breakdowns like this are what you come here for, go ahead and subscribe, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Now, let's start with the myth everyone believes, and why it's incomplete. Most of what English-speaking audiences believe about Rome's fall traces back to one specific source, a British historian named Edward Gibbon, who between 1776 and 1789 published a massive, 6-volume work called The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It's one of the most influential history books ever written in the English language, and it's also, in crucial ways, a product of its own era's biases. Gibbon's central argument was that Rome fell because of internal moral and civic decay, that Romans lost the discipline, the civic virtue, and the willingness to sacrifice for the state that had built the empire, and that the rise of Christianity specifically accelerated this decline by shifting Roman focus away from earthly civic duty toward otherworldly salvation. It's a compelling narrative. It's also, according to the overwhelming majority of modern historians who've had 2.5 centuries to test it against archaeological and documentary evidence, seriously incomplete and in some places flatly contradicted by what we now know. Modern scholarship doesn't reject Gibbon because his writing was bad. His prose remains genuinely brilliant. Modern scholarship has moved past parts of his conclusion because we now have things Gibbon never had access to. Tree ring climate data, ice core samples revealing ancient volcanic activity, genetic analysis of plague pathogens preserved in ancient skeletons, coin hoards revealing currency debasement patterns, and administrative records Gibbon simply couldn't have known about. So let's set the popular myth aside, not because it's completely wrong, since Rome absolutely did face internal political dysfunction, but because it's dramatically incomplete. The real answer is bigger, stranger, and honestly more relevant to how any large, complex society can come apart than people got lazy ever was. Here's the first thing that surprises most people. The traditional date given for Rome's fall, 476 AD, when a Germanic general named Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor, comes roughly 300 years after the empire had already passed its point of greatest strength and started facing serious structural problems. This wasn't a healthy empire suddenly struck down. It was an empire in slow, uneven decline for centuries, with periods of genuine recovery mixed in before its final collapse in the West. At its height, under emperors like Trajan and Hadrian in the early 2nd century AD, Rome controlled roughly 5 million square kilometers of territory and governed somewhere between 50 and 90 million people, depending on which historian's population estimates you use. An almost incomprehensible administrative achievement for the ancient world, built on Roman roads, Roman law, and a shared Mediterranean trade network that connected Britain to Egypt to Syria under a single political system. That scale was also, from the very beginning, the seed of the empire's long-term vulnerability. An empire this large needed an enormous, expensive military to defend borders stretching across 3 continents. It needed a functioning currency and tax system sophisticated enough to fund that military across those same vast distances. And it needed political stability at the top, a reliable, broadly accepted method of transferring power from one emperor to the next, to keep the entire machine from tearing itself apart during succession crises. For roughly 200 years, from Augustus's reign beginning around 27 BC through the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD, Rome largely managed all 3 of these challenges well enough to produce what historians call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. It wasn't peaceful everywhere, and it wasn't equally good for everyone living under it, but it was, by ancient standards, an extraordinary stretch of relative internal stability and economic integration. What comes after 180 AD is where things start breaking down, and where the real documented causes of Rome's eventual collapse actually begin. In 235 AD, the Roman Emperor Severus Alexander was murdered by his own troops, and what followed is a 50-year stretch modern historians call the Crisis of the 3rd Century, a period so severe that Rome came remarkably close to permanently collapsing nearly 2.5 centuries before it actually did. During this 50-year window, historians count at least 26 different men claiming the title of Roman Emperor, the vast majority of them installed by military force and then murdered by their own soldiers or rival generals within months or a few short years. This wasn't a stable transfer of power happening occasionally. This was the imperial office becoming functionally a violent revolving door, with the Roman military itself essentially auctioning off the throne to whichever general could pay and control the troops. At the exact same moment, the empire faced invasions on nearly every border simultaneously. Gothic tribes pressing across the Danube in the north, the newly aggressive Sasanian Persian Empire attacking in the east, and in 260 AD, in one of the most stunning humiliations in Roman history, the Roman Emperor Valerian was captured alive in battle by Persian forces and, according to several ancient sources, held as a prisoner and used as a literal human footstool by the Persian king until his death. The empire, for a period during this crisis, actually split into 3 competing pieces: a breakaway Gallic Empire in the west, a breakaway Palmyrene Empire in the east, and a shrinking central Roman territory in between, before being forcibly reunified by a series of tough, effective soldier emperors, particularly Aurelian, who is still remembered by historians as Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world, for pulling the empire back from what looked like near-certain permanent fragmentation. Rome survived the 3rd century crisis, but surviving isn't the same as recovering fully, and the empire that emerged from this 50-year near collapse was structurally different, and in important ways permanently weaker than the one that had entered it. Here's a factor that rarely makes it into the popular version of this story, and it's one modern economic historians consider absolutely central: currency collapse. At the start of the empire, the standard Roman silver coin, the denarius, was genuinely close to pure silver. By the middle of the 3rd century crisis, facing catastrophic costs from constant warfare and needing to pay soldiers and buy loyalty, Roman emperors had debased that same coin down to roughly 5% silver content or less, essentially producing what was by that point a silver-washed bronze coin while insisting it still held its original face value. Predictably, this triggered severe inflation. Prices for basic goods across the empire spiked dramatically through the 3rd century, and trust in Roman currency, which had underpinned trade across the entire Mediterranean world, began breaking down. The Emperor Diocletian, taking power in 284 AD, tried to address this directly with his famous edict on maximum prices in 301 AD, an empire-wide attempt to freeze prices by law and stop the inflation by government decree. It failed, and it's worth understanding exactly why it failed, because the underlying economic logic still applies today. You cannot solve a currency debasement problem by making it illegal for prices to reflect that debasement. Merchants across the empire, according to surviving accounts, simply stopped selling goods openly rather than sell at a loss, driving trade underground into black markets, and the edict was eventually abandoned as unworkable. This mattered enormously for what came later, because a functioning tax base and stable currency are what fund a professional military. As Roman currency destabilized and tax collection became less reliable, particularly in more remote provinces, the empire's ability to fund the massive standing army it needed to defend its enormous borders became progressively more strained. Right at the exact moment external pressure on those borders was intensifying. Diocletian's other major reform, alongside his failed price controls, was one that would fundamentally reshape the empire's trajectory. In 285 AD, recognizing that no single emperor could effectively govern and defend territory this vast, he formally split administrative control of the empire into western and eastern halves, eventually evolving into a 4-emperor system called the Tetrarchy. This wasn't intended as a permanent division into 2 separate empires. Diocletian saw it as an administrative efficiency measure within one unified Roman state. But over the following century, the eastern and western halves increasingly developed separate priorities, separate military resources, and, critically, separate levels of economic strength. The eastern half centered eventually on Constantinople, Founded by Emperor Constantine in 330 AD on the site of the older city of Byzantium, controlled wealthier, more urbanized, more defensible territory with shorter, more manageable land borders to protect. The western half was left holding a much harder geographic and economic position. Longer borders along the Rhine and Danube facing increasing pressure from migrating peoples, a less monetized rural economy, and this is a detail that gets lost in most popular retellings. A tax base that was, over time, simply less capable of funding the military Rome needed to hold those borders, compared to the wealthier East. By the 4th and 5th centuries, the Eastern Empire was, in real terms, richer and more stable than the West. And when crises hit both halves simultaneously, the East increasingly had the resources to weather them while the West did not. This split is one of the most important, least discussed reasons the collapse happened specifically in the West, while Rome's eastern half, which we today call the Byzantine Empire, didn't fall for another 1,000 years, surviving until 1453. Read that again because it's the detail that should completely reframe how you think about this story. Rome, in a very real sense, didn't fall in 476 AD. Half of it did. The other half kept going for another millennium. Here's a cause of Roman decline that has only become widely understood by historians in roughly the last 2 decades, thanks largely to advances in ancient DNA analysis. Recurring, devastating pandemic disease. The Antonine Plague, striking the empire starting around 165 AD, likely smallpox or a related virus, brought back by Roman soldiers returning from campaigns in the East, killed an estimated 5 to 10 million people over roughly 2 decades, by some historian estimates as much as 10% of the empire's total population. Then, roughly a century later, starting around 249 AD, the Plague of Cyprian struck, another catastrophic pandemic whose exact pathogen still isn't fully identified by modern science, hitting right in the middle of the already devastating 3rd century crisis and compounding it severely. Modern climate science has added another layer historians didn't have access to even 20 years ago. Ice core samples and tree ring data reveal that starting in the mid-6th century, technically after the Western Empire's traditional 476 AD collapse, but directly affecting the Eastern Empire and the broader post-Roman world, a period researchers now call the Late Antique Little Ice Age began. Triggered partly by a series of massive volcanic eruptions that measurably cooled the climate across Europe for decades, disrupting agriculture and likely weakening population resistance right before the devastating plague of Justinian struck in 541 AD, a pandemic some historians estimate killed up to a quarter of the population in affected regions. None of this fits neatly into Romans got morally lazy. A population repeatedly hit by pandemic disease on the scale of losing 5, 10, 25% of its people within a few generations faces catastrophic labor shortages, military recruitment shortfalls, and tax base collapse, regardless of anyone's individual virtue or work ethic. This is one of the clearest places where modern science has fundamentally revised the popular understanding of Rome's decline, and it's barely mentioned in most textbooks most Americans grew up reading. By the 4th and 5th centuries, facing chronic manpower and funding shortages, the Roman military had transformed significantly from the disciplined citizen legions of the early empire. Rome increasingly relied on foederati, allied or subordinate groups, frequently Germanic in origin, who served in Roman military structures in exchange for land, payment, or political arrangements, sometimes serving loyally for generations and sometimes not. This wasn't inherently a fatal weakness. The Roman military had incorporated non-Roman soldiers throughout its history. But by the late empire, the scale and the terms of this reliance had shifted dramatically, and Roman central authorities' actual control over these forces had weakened correspondingly. Roman commanders of full or partial Germanic origin, most notably a general named Stilicho in the early 5th century, held enormous effective power within the supposedly Roman command structure, a sign of how thoroughly the line between Roman military and allied Germanic military had blurred by this point. The pressure driving Germanic peoples toward Roman territory in the first place has its own well-documented cause, and it's worth naming clearly: the Huns. This nomadic confederation, sweeping in from Central Asia through the late 4th century under increasingly centralized leadership, eventually including the famous Attila, pushed westward with devastating military effectiveness, displacing and terrifying Gothic and other Germanic populations who had lived for generations along Rome's northern frontier. In 376 AD, a massive population of Gothic refugees fleeing the advancing Huns arrived at the Danube River and requested permission to cross into Roman territory as refugees, not as an invading army, but as displaced people seeking safety from an existential threat behind them. Rome, under Emperor Valens, granted permission. What followed is one of the most consequential failures of administration in the empire's entire history. Corrupt local Roman officials, tasked with managing the resettlement, exploited the desperate Gothic refugees so severely. According to ancient historian Ammianus Marcellinus, including forcing starving families to trade their own children into slavery in exchange for dog meat to eat, that the Goths, understandably, rose in open revolt. 2 years later, in 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, this Gothic force decisively defeated a Roman army, killing Emperor Valens himself on the battlefield, one of the most catastrophic Roman military defeats in the empire's history, and a clear demonstration that Rome's own administrative corruption, not just external military pressure, had directly created one of its most dangerous enemies. What follows Adrianople is roughly a century of accelerating fragmentation across the Western Empire specifically, while the wealthier Eastern Empire, centered on Constantinople, largely stabilizes and endures. In 410 AD, Visigothic forces under King Alaric, the same broad population whose mistreatment at the Danube decades earlier had triggered the Adrianople disaster, sacked the city of Rome itself. It's worth being precise about what this did and didn't mean. Rome hadn't been the empire's actual administrative capital for decades by this point. That role had shifted to Ravenna and, for the East, Constantinople. So this wasn't the fall of the empire's government, but symbolically, the sack of a city that hadn't fallen to a foreign enemy in roughly 800 years sent shockwaves across the entire Mediterranean world. And it's the event that reportedly prompted the Christian theologian Augustine to begin writing his major work, The City of God, directly responding to pagan critics who blamed Rome's troubles on its abandonment of the old gods for Christianity. The following decades saw the Western Empire's territory shrink steadily and its central authority weaken further. The Vandals, another Germanic group, crossed into North Africa in 429 AD and, critically, captured Carthage in 439 AD, seizing control of one of the Western Empire's most important grain-producing provinces and dealing a severe blow to Rome's remaining tax revenue and food supply. In 451 AD, a combined Roman and allied Gothic force under General Aetius managed to halt Attila the Hun's invasion of Gaul at the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, one of the last major Western Roman military successes, but achieved only through alliance with the same Germanic peoples the empire had once ruled as subjects, another sign of how completely the old power dynamic had inverted. By the mid to late 5th century, the Western Roman emperor had become, in practical terms, largely a figurehead, with real military and political power increasingly held by Germanic military commanders operating within but not fully controlled by Roman institutional structures. This is the essential context for understanding what actually happened in 476 AD, because when it finally came, it wasn't a dramatic final battle. It was almost anticlimactic. In 476 AD, a Germanic military commander named Odoacer, serving within the Roman military structure, deposed the reigning Western Roman emperor, a teenager named Romulus Augustulus, whose name carries an almost poetic irony, since Romulus was the mythical founder of Rome and Augustulus, meaning Little Augustus, referenced the empire's first emperor. Odoacer didn't install a new Roman emperor to replace him. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, effectively acknowledging the Eastern Emperor Zeno as sole legitimate Roman emperor, while ruling Italy himself as a king under nominal Eastern authority. Here's what should genuinely surprise you about this moment. Contemporary sources barely register it as a historically significant event. There's no ancient account describing 476 AD as the day Rome fell. That framing was applied by later historians, centuries afterward, looking back and identifying this specific administrative transition as a convenient marker for a process that had, in reality, been unfolding gradually for 100 years already. To people actually living through it, particularly in the Eastern Empire, Roman civilization didn't feel like it had ended at all, because in the East, it hadn't. The Eastern Roman Empire, which its own citizens continued calling simply Romania, the Roman state, right up until its actual final collapse, continued for nearly another 1,000 years. Through military triumphs and disasters, through the reign of Justinian, who briefly reconquered much of the old Western territory, including Italy and North Africa in the 6th century, through religious transformation, through the rise of Islam reshaping its eastern borders, until Constantinople finally fell to Ottoman forces in 1453. Nearly 1,000 years after the Western fall, most people think of as the end of Rome. So even the basic premise embedded in most people's understanding that Rome fell in 476 AD is at best half true. What actually fell in 476 was Western Roman political authority in Italy specifically. Roman civilization, Roman law, Roman administrative tradition, and direct institutional continuity from the original Roman state continued for another millennium, just centered somewhere most Americans never learned much about in school. If you've made it this far, you already have a more complete answer than most people ever get. But let's put it together directly, because historians today generally don't point to one cause. They point to a compounding, multi-causal collapse, where several serious, independently documented problems hit simultaneously and made each other worse. Currency debasement and chronic inflation weakened the tax base needed to fund the military. A revolving door of short-lived, frequently murdered emperors during the 3rd century crisis and recurring political instability afterward prevented consistent long-term governance and defense strategy. Recurring pandemic disease on a scale we're only now fully appreciating thanks to modern genetic science repeatedly devastated population and labor supply. Climate instability in the late antique period disrupted agricultural output at a critical moment. The administrative split between a wealthier East and a poorer, harder-to-defend West meant that when crises hit both halves, only one had the resources to survive them. And Roman administrative failures, specifically, the corrupt mismanagement of the Gothic refugee crisis in 376 AD, directly converted a manageable humanitarian situation into one of the empire's most dangerous military enemies. Moral decay, in the way Gibbon originally framed it, Romans simply becoming too soft, too decadent, too disconnected from civic virtue, isn't the through line modern historians point to as the primary driver, though Roman writers themselves absolutely worried about exactly this, in exactly the way people in any complex, comfortable society tend to worry about their own decline. What the evidence actually supports is closer to something far more universal and honestly more useful for understanding any large system, ancient or modern. Complex institutions that depend on a functioning currency, stable succession, resilient supply chains, and administrative competence can withstand a lot of individual shocks. What they generally cannot withstand is all of those systems failing at once, compounding each other faster than the institution can adapt. America's founding generation studied Rome obsessively. You can see it in the architecture of Washington, D.C., in the design of the Senate, in the very language the framers used when they debated how to build a republic that wouldn't collapse the way Rome eventually did. They weren't wrong to study it closely. But if they'd had access to what we know now, ice cores, ancient DNA, coin hoard analysis, administrative records historians have only fully cross-referenced in the last few decades, they might have taken a different lesson than the one Gibbon handed them. Not a story about a people who simply got lazy and paid for it. A story about how even the most powerful, sophisticated system ever built in the ancient world had real, specific, documentable vulnerabilities: economic, administrative, environmental, and military. And how those vulnerabilities, compounding together over roughly 2 centuries, eventually mattered more than any amount of individual virtue on the ground could offset. Rome didn't fall because Romans stopped caring. Rome fell because the systems holding an empire that sized together broke down faster than anyone at the time could fix them. And the part of Rome that had stronger systems in place lasted another 1,000 years. If this gave you a real evidence-based answer to a question most people only get the Hollywood version of, hit like, subscribe if you're not already, and let me know in the comments, out of everything covered here, which factor surprised you the most? And tell me which empire's collapse you want broken down next.